Okay, now that it's 1:01, I think it's time to get started. Hello, everyone. It's hard to believe, but also wonderful to see this conference in full swing. It's all virtual, but the energy you have brought is amazingly palpable. Thank you to everyone who has been attending the sessions and for your intentional engagement with the speakers and other participants. 2 more panel breakout sessions will follow this Friday afternoon keynote. Afternoon for some people. I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone who helped make this conference possible. Our platinum sponsors, the J.M. Kaplan Fund and the Newman's Own Foundation, gold sponsor, the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven, and silver sponsor, BDO FMA. All the speakers for delivering such thought-provoking and action-inducing conversations. Our advisory board, whose support and guidance has been crucial to making this conference possible, Yale faculty and staff members, and the organizing committee for their sweat, minds, and hearts towards making this event successful. Thank you.
The Yale Philanthropy Conference originated at the Yale School of Management in the year 2004 and has been taking place almost every year since. In many ways, it's a tradition that we student organizers hold close to our hearts and feel very privileged shaping. This past year in particular has taught us so much about this responsibility we have to host a conference that questions and redefines the structures and functioning of this sector, the institutions we all belong to, and the society at large. These questions, of course, don't stop today, and we hope to continue learning and growing from the very people that contribute to it every year. And we believe that this closing keynote today, this afternoon, will serve to push us to continue striving to use the power afforded to us by our privileges in a radical, inclusive, and equitable way.
It is my immense pleasure to introduce Pia Infante, trustee and co-executive director of the Whitman Institute, an independent foundation that leverages trust-based philanthropy for social, political, and economic equity. Pia draws on decades of multi-sector experience as an educator, facilitator, organizational consultant, executive coach, nonprofit manager, business owner, and writer and speaker stewarding the Whitman Institute's mission and spend out, slated for 2022. Pia believes we have the collective imagination and power to redesign philanthropy to center the people we serve. In particular, she advocates for deep, inclusive collaboration that listens to and follows the leadership of those who directly experience the pain points of inequities. She serves on the boards of Verilis Center for Art and Politics and MediaJustice.org. She is a visiting faculty at the University of Vermont's Rubenstein School of Environment. Pia lives in Oakland with her spouse and toddler daughter. She's currently joining us from Costa Rica. Welcome, Pia.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. What a beautiful welcome, and thank you for all of the organizing that went into this and all the thoughtfulness. I've been getting a little taste of the sessions today and just incredible conversations that I'm happy to get to join in on the fun. So that was a very long introduction of me. A short way to say it is that I'm a queer Filipina immigrant from California who runs a foundation and also is part of a collective called the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. And I'm honored to have been asked to be here. So I was up all night because it's also very hot here in Costa Rica, not that I'm complaining, thinking about what to share with you all. We've been reflecting on 2020, so welcome to month 14 of 2020, as some of us have been thinking about it. And I know the topic that I posed was there's no going back. I want to think a little bit about that. There's no going back. My subtopics are accountability and imagination. So I'm just going to ask us all for a moment, where were you in March of 2020 when it fully began to dawn on you that this thing, this coronavirus, this COVID situation was, maybe it wasn't March for some of you, maybe some of you were faster on the uptake and it was the year before, or it was January. But for me, I remember very clearly March 2020, and we're coming up on a year anniversary. And I remember it, COVID impacted my family immediately. My uncle was one of the first people in California to be diagnosed, and then eventually he passed away from it. And so the severity of the situation was brought very close to home very quickly, as now 500,000, almost 500,000 other families have unfortunately experienced since that moment. But there was this moment where, as it first began to take shape, I thought, and maybe many of us thought, okay, let's figure out how we're gonna wrap this up. Maybe we're gonna be quarantined for a month, 6 weeks at the top. I remember actually saying to someone, how long do you think this is gonna be? And this many months later, this is where we are. So I don't think there's going to be any kind of return to a life before 2020. Similar to after 9/11, there's just no such thing as wearing shoes when you go through security anymore, for the most part. And for so many, things have been irrevocably changed, some for good and a lot for not. So just to give us a little bit of context of things that you already know, but just I want to lay out, because I want to give philanthropy a grade for how we did in 2020. But just to say, some of the things that were happening, and again, they've been discussed many times in your sessions. So I just did this for myself because 2020 felt like it was 10 years long. And that March of 2020 feels like a much longer time ago than it actually seems on the books. But the experience of living through it as doing the work that I do, but also as a parent of a toddler, and what was going on in the world and in my global extended family. So we were experiencing a once in a century health pandemic of global proportions. Once in a century. This doesn't happen often, this type of pandemic. We also saw the largest multicultural, interconnected movement for racial justice that this country has ever seen. In terms of actual scale and interconnected network leadership, the movement that sort of was sparked by the killing of George Floyd was larger than the actual civil rights movement that some of us may have been here for. And it was so many different segments of society coming together and saying no more, and that what we were doing was not enough when it came to racial justice. We also saw, obviously, the economic, social, climate impacts of COVID, businesses closing, people losing their jobs. We also saw a very backwards health system that left many of the who are already vulnerable even more vulnerable in this moment, and just continuing to welcome the lovely people that are coming. And the last thing I'll say, there are a lot of things happening in 2020, but the last thing I'll say is we saw a significant, organized, white national attack on our democracy. It was taking place throughout, maybe long before January 6th, but certainly the uprising or the insurrection at the Capitol, which threatened many lives ultimately and took some, was probably the most significant attack, deliberate and direct attack, and some would say orchestrated attack on our democracy since the Civil War. So all this to say, this is what was happening in 2020, among many other things. And 2020, what I think it showed us is it exacerbated all that was already not working. It exacerbated an inhumane social system. It exacerbated a vulnerable and weak democracy in many senses. The fact that philanthropy had to be relied on to make sure that we had free and fair elections, for instance, I think is not necessarily a sign of strength. It's a sign of weakness in terms of the fabric of civil society. So that is the backdrop of 2020, which you all lived through, so I know you know. You can toggle between the polls in the chat, and if you want to tell us what kind of institution you're coming in from, that'd be great. That's in the polls. So let's get along to, how did philanthropy do? Philanthropy essentially is meant to, meet these kinds of crises, to help maybe prevent these kinds of crises. There's a lot I could say about the model of philanthropy, where it comes from, and why it was born. I think there are many more articulate people than I, but let's just say that in a highly functional civil society, we would hope that philanthropy would not be necessary, because no one would be left behind. No one would be unhoused, hungry, uneducated, whatever that is. So in our country, philanthropy is robust because inequity is robust. So here's the grade that I would give us. as a sector? Because of course, this is the Yale Philanthropy Conference, and this is the first time I've ever given a plenary at a academic institution of this kind. So I would give us a B minus, C plus B minus. So the good things, and some of those good things have been named in some of the sessions. Clearly, we saw some emergency responsiveness in our sector. We saw a rise in the total amount of capital that went out the door. We saw people giving more than they planned to, whether it's institutions or individual donors. Apparently, some data we just saw from the Lilly School of Philanthropy, the rise was in terms of the total amount of monies given in 2020 from philanthropy actually was significantly due to individual donors. So there was a reduced burden on nonprofits. There were loosened funding restrictions. More people came to embrace the notion of unrestricted support. There was what I would call, in my Pia vernacular, a come to Jesus moment for philanthropy around naming white supremacy as one of the core elements, or some of the building blocks of philanthropy are laced with white supremacy. And so there was a much more frank discussion about racial justice and racial equity in the philanthropic sector. I mean, it's been going on, PRE, for instance, Philanthropy for Racial Equity has been sparking that conversation for many years. But in terms of as a whole, there were almost no philanthropies that I came into contact with in 2020 that weren't taking a look at who they were funding and how they were funding them, and taking a look at some of the internal cultural dynamics of our institutions. So that was happening. And I would say that, funding for systems change or funding systems change, I think there was more of an appetite for systems change and advocacy and grassroots organizing, funding those things. I'm not sure anyone's taking the poll, so I'm just going to stick with the chat. And feel free to comment in the chat any of your thoughts and experiences. We're going to have a Q&A at the end. So that contributes to my grade of B minus C plus. I think that when I think about what were some of the biggest wins in the political imagination for 2020, they weren't emergency funding. They were some of the long-term patient capital that had been happening in states like Arizona and Georgia for a long time. States where voter suppression efforts have been high, states where people of color, BIPOC and communities of color have a really large presence, and there have been forces at play for many years to make sure that their votes don't get counted or are never asked for or solicited. So the wins that I saw for democracy, not partisan wins, but the wins around more than half of the country wanting to retain a representative democracy that is held by free and fair elections. I think some of those wins were actually coming from long-term, multi-year funding for efforts in states where that was so contested. So, and I see some commentary on that in the chat, so I appreciate that. I think why we're still pretty far from an A+ in this sector is that it took an apocalyptic end of times year like 2020 to get any of this to happen. Some of, nonprofits, social movement leaders have been asking for many of these things. Debureaucratize philanthropy's processes, for instance, or really take a look at power and sharing power in collaboration and partnership. None of these are new concepts. None of the concepts that you'll find on the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project website are rocket science, as I say all the time. Yet it took a crisis of major proportions that has taken nearly 500,000 of our population for many of these things to happen, for 800 foundations to make a pledge to be less burdensome in their processes and relationships with the people who they have the power of resources and decision-making about resources for. It took one of the biggest racial justice mobilizations of our time. So that to me is definitely a mark against us, and I would put that in the feedback of my report card. All this to say that I think we did all right. We did, I think we tried to hold up some, the cracks that folks were falling through, whether it came to housing, joblessness, healthcare. We tried. But the truth is we are up against a system that is really not created to benefit most people, as we know, which is, so I want to talk about accountability first and then imagination. I think that thankfully, we seem to have an administration that both believes in governance and wants to govern in a democratic way. But I don't think that means that we can sit back and go back to whatever we were doing before the pandemic hit. I think the truth is we should have been funding differently before 2020 in terms of long-term existing and racialized inequities in this country that show up in the political system, social system, education, housing, everywhere. And I also think that we should keep funding as if the pandemics aren't over, because they are not. And I'm saying this, it's really interesting for those who know me, because I'm really a very optimistic person. The truth is, I think we can have optimism, but we can't lose the sense of accountability that many of us might have felt really clearly in 2020, and that we may continue to feel. The sense of responsibility for more than just an emergency response to crisis, but a sense of responsibility to transform our systems so that they work for more people. So that's the sense of accountability that I feel. I'm sure that all of you here feel it. You're attending a conference over Zoom and paying attention in so many different ways to the many creative and generative ideas that are being shared here. So that's sort of the first half of my talk around accountability. There are or were some poll questions, but I'm not sure they're totally necessary at this point. In terms of some of the data that I relied on to give me my B- C+ grade, I did look at what Center for Effective Philanthropy, National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, Candid, Stanford Social Innovation Review, Inside Philanthropy, and the Chronicle Philanthropy have been reporting about what's been happening. And one thing I did notice just on the accountability piece is that CEP did a study of funder behavior change in 2020. And one thing that I noticed is that while many funders were willing to loosen restrictions, be less burdensome, move more money, and move it in an unrestricted way, two major things. There still are very few multi-year, long patient capital type investments, even during the apocalyptic year we've just experienced. And two, they found that, and the appetite to maybe continue some of what happened in 2020 is medium. It's not necessarily high. And also, of maybe around 200 foundations that were surveyed, 60% of them had less than a 25% people of color on their boards. And there was not a significant sense that that was something folks were really invested in changing. So as we start to as I turn the rest of my talk towards imagination and creativity, I just want to say that I'm going to talk about other things, but multi-year unrestricted funding and a much more diversified set of strategists who are much more proximate to the problems are going to be core to any of our solutions moving forward. Alrighty, let's see if I'm missing any questions in the chat. Not necessarily. Great. And Peace Development Fund, thank you for mentioning. You have, yes, been funding in this way. Do I think unrestricted fund allows for nimbleness? Absolutely. I mean, interesting, because I'll tell you a story. So what unrestricted funding provides to, say, a nonprofit organization or a social movement organization is the ability to literally be nimble to what they are facing. So we fund, for instance, an organization called On the Move in Napa Valley that does a number of things, youth incubated projects, including those initiated by foster youth. When the Santa Rosa fires hit in California a few years ago, this same organization, mainly a youth development organization doing some organizing work, became a hub for all of the migrant families that were sort of out of house and home and job all of a sudden because of the fires. meaning they became an emergency response center, which is not what they're trained to do, not necessarily part of their program, but they were literally meeting the needs of the people in their community, many undocumented folks who were afraid to go to the regular social agencies of their town in Napa to get service because they were afraid of being deported by ICE. This was a couple of years ago. So unrestricted funds allow that nonprofit to make a call, and the call doesn't have to be, the funding we got is to do youth development, except the need that's facing us because of COVID, because of this fire, because of whatever, we need to pivot, we need to change. So unrestricted funding allows the folks that are closest to the problems to make decisions about how they roll, whenever something happens. Because if 2020 doesn't show us that uncertainty is constant, I'm not sure what else it could show us. So just to pause and answer that question. So I want to talk about some of the things that did also emerge that I think are potential models for imagination, a bigger imagination in our sector. One, there was a larger movement towards pooled funding, especially towards racial justice efforts. So pooled funding around, for instance, there's the Democracy Frontlines Fund that was initiated by the Lieber Foundation it's 10 Black-led organizations, a huge amount of capital to them over 10 years to help build power and preserve democracy. And there's another one called the Black Liberation Fund at Solidaire Network. So these are pooled funds in which any number of individual donors or other foundations come in and they literally pool their funds for a common strategy. And the funds are all unrestricted and multi-year. So I think that's a sort of brilliant way to think about what are some models to try on so that we don't revert back to our habits and behaviors. It takes a long time to get out of habits. So people might think, okay, I can loosen grant restrictions and I can not be burdensome to my grantees in 2020, but hey, it's 2021. Although many conditions have not necessarily changed. So I'd say that these pooled funds are an incredible example of how to open our imagination to not always having to work as an innovative individual. I live normally in the Bay Area, and I think that the concept of innovation can be inspiring and catalytic, and I think it can actually be really harmful. It goes back to a mention of white supremacy, that the only good ideas come from individuals, often white folks. And I think many other cultures show us that collectivism and collective decision-making and collective visioning is where many solutions lay. So pooled funds are an example of collaboration, and I think work against an inherent culture in our sector that has us thinking that we have to be just expert individuals versus practitioners who are all in it together to learn how to make things work for more people. There's another example that I wanted to talk about called the Foundation for Black Communities in Canada. It's a new entity that's been started by a group of young Black activists in Canada. They did a study that showed that in Canada, 7 cents to every $100 go to Black Canadians, 7 cents to every $100. And instead of then launching an advocacy campaign to try to implore foundations to just give more grants to Black-led organizations or Black activism or Black grassroots organizing or Black community service organizations, they challenged Canadian foundations to give 3% of their endowments, whatever their endowment size, to this foundation so that these funds could be stewarded and self-determined by Black community leaders in Canada. That's an incredible example. It reminds me of what Nick Tilson is doing here in the United States with the NDN Collective and Indigenous funding Indigenous-led self-determination, but really just giving capital over to the NDN Collective and others like it. I think one other example, before I start talking a little bit more about trust-based philanthropy, is there's something called the Just Fund portal. And so folks always ask me, why don't we have a common application? Like the way colleges do. You can have a common application to get into a number of colleges. In philanthropy, we don't have that. We've never had that. Every individual foundation is often its own foundation. The Just Fund portal, I'll just shout out, had moved $80 million last year. And it is a sort of a hub for nonprofits and funders to connect with each other swiftly around getting funds. And they have partnered with Amalgamated Bank. So I think it's an interesting model to look at, to collectivize some of the work that often happens in silos in organizations. I'm going to look at this question. How do we balance and nudge away the expectations of white funding partners or major donors who are often used to top-down goal setting, data-heavy, restrictive funding models? We are working on improving multi-year funding that tackles. That is a good question. I think that's a culture question, Razak. I think what I want to talk about next is what we need to shift in terms of culture, because I think you can read trust-based philanthropy as a set of grant-making technologies. You know, it's multi-year unrestricted funding, it's streamlining paperwork, it's support beyond the check. It's, but those are simply, they're not, you know, trust-based philanthropy is not a checklist of grant-making technologies. Essentially, it is about understanding, you know, how power gets attributed. And in our society, if you have money, you have power. I mean, just look at the individual donor, Mackenzie Scott. I think there's so much commendable about how swiftly Mackenzie Scott moved that money. And the groups that were supported that were often very underfunded groups. At the same time, should power accrue and be attributed to individuals simply because they're sitting on top of a lot of money. So in a sense, I think that your question, while complicated, is not that complicated. We need to work on a larger culture shift around the mindset of what it means to be attributed power. And then if we're attributed power, not to hoard it, you know, how to learn how to share it in these collectivized ways that there are many examples of, I'm sure, here. I tried to pronounce your name right. So let me move on because I just want you to know I have pages and pages of things I want to say to you, and I'm probably not going to say them all. I want to talk a little bit about where do we go from here? How do we get an A+, or how do we do so well that we don't need to exist? There are many factors outside of philanthropy itself. I mean, if we look at just the amount of the economic pie that philanthropy is, it's nowhere near as big as private, as business or government. But what our role could be ultimately, I think what our role could be ultimately is to help steer all of our systems in this country, you know, social, political, economic, to ones that are equitable and just. Lots of other folks in that work, you know, obviously Unity, NCRP, justice funders, tons of resources towards a world that really works for everyone is the way that I think of it. In the meantime, because again, you know, from this question in the chat, we see that there's still this overstructure that we're often working against. And I appreciate someone talking about Mackenzie's gift being helpful. I think that Mackenzie's gifts seem incredibly helpful, and the way and how swiftly they move were incredibly helpful. I think the comment I was making was less about Mackenzie individually, who I respect, but really that, you know, folks like Gates and Bezos and, you know, just because they accrue so much capital and money, they are somehow looked towards to, you know, solve for inequities. That, you know, whatever. I'm not the first person to say this. You can talk to Anand. Okay, there's sort of a lot of questions coming, so I'm going to just try to finish my comments and then address questions. I want to talk a little bit about what trust-based philanthropy means to me today. The project has been around for a year. I think we at the Whitman Institute started talking about it because of our grantee partners pushing us to try to get other folks to do similar things, maybe 6 years ago. And it's taken shape. It's taken shape and direction, and in an open source way that I am truly stunned by. I had, you know, the fact that I'm here giving a plenary on trust-based philanthropy essentially is surprising to me. I wouldn't have thought this after just such a handful of years, but I think to peer organizing and incredible partners like some of you that are on this session, the concept of it really has moved. And the challenge that I have for us is accountability and imagination. Yes, we still need more unrestricted funds. Absolutely. We still need more multi-year commitments, and we still need to diversify who is in the decision-making roles at every executive level and trustee level in philanthropy in order to help transform the sector to make it much more accountable to the communities that we're trying to serve. I also think we really need to imagine bigger. Like, how can we broaden our sense of creativity and imagination so that trust-based philanthropy isn't a checklist of things you can do in terms of grant making, but it's about literally how we embody racial justice principles. It's literally how, in every level of relationship, it's literally being collaborative, humble, listening, and feedback oriented, regardless of our position or title. It's really seeing our role not just as folks who move money, but folks who move culture. And again, I think there's a lot more brilliant people talking about this in addition to me, but I just like to call out Enwamaka Agbo from Katali Foundation, Salome Lema from Thousand Currents, and Nicole Boucher from Way to Win. These are all women of color doing some deep thinking about how we expand our imagination beyond the structures that we are inhabiting, because the moment calls for us to do it. And I have a very short list of, things I want to end with that we can start with, including some of the examples that I set out. But I think one of the things is ask ourselves, how are we hoarding power and money? Meaning maybe we didn't do so in 2020, but are we reverting back to that sensibility? Are we going back to our habits of hoarding power and money implicitly? I'm going to say this again. I've said this before. Why aren't 10-year grants the default instead of 1-year grants? I want to talk a little bit about risk. I think we need to have a much more expanded imagination about risk. I know that there were some folks talking about risk and impact, and I was really learning a lot from them in an earlier session. But what are we really risking? And I think in philanthropy, it's often reputational risk, because these monies, these endowments, these funds, in whatever structure that there's already been a decision to give it away. So it's not a risk of losing money, right? That money is moving. So when we think about risk, sometimes it seems like more about ego and reputation and whether we'll be seen as strategic or data-driven. And I want to say that, we live in America, and I think venture capital, for instance, is sort of lauded for taking risks. Venture capital projects often fail, and yet there's this sensibility that somehow venture capital is innovative because it's risk-taking. Philanthropy in general is overarchingly overly risk-averse. It's overly codified, and it's overly about compliance. So I'd ask you to think about how much of the staff roles in your organization are about compliance and risk aversion versus about proximity, risk, and really making an impact for the communities that are literally losing jobs, homes, lives on a daily basis. So reimagining our relationship to risk, I think, is part of trust-based philanthropy. I also think, I hope that the conversation about white supremacy and how it inhabits our leadership, the way we do things, our reliance on the academy, sometimes speaking at an academy, to really question. I hope those questions persist. I hope they persist well beyond 2020 and 2021. Because if we don't answer them, I think we will end up again, as we may have all felt on January 6th, just a hair's breadth of losing, the semblance of this democratic experiment that we have been holding for a few hundred years. And I say this, I hope, without sounding catastrophic, because that was a catastrophe. It continues to be a catastrophe to have this farcical notion that we have a two-party system. Well, we do have a two-party system. I'm not trying to speak in a partisan way, but I think that you can be for inclusive representative democracy and you can be against it. And I think that's a nonpartisan statement. And I think philanthropy needs to be for inclusive, representative, and fair democracy. I don't see how we can have any other sense of our role. So those are some of the things I wanted to say. I'm not going to read you all of my notes. Creativity. I wanted to end on creativity because this is a grind. I'm sweating a lot. Do you see the sweat? It's not that I'm nervous necessarily, it's that it's 95 degrees in this room. This is a grind to do this work. Think about nonprofits and social movement leaders, the work that we're doing. And I think that if we aren't creative and we aren't imaginative, then we're basically replicating the same systems of extraction that sort of got us here. So I guess the other question I'd have for you in terms of accountability and imagination is, how much creativity do you feel in your work? How much creativity exists, in your institution? And again, how much of your staff is oriented towards creativity versus compliance? So I'm gonna end there. Oh, thank you, Dimple. I did reel off a whole bunch of great names. I will also add Dimple Abichandani to that. Phil Lee is here. Crystal Haling from Libra Foundation. I'm a fan club of one to many, many, many leaders of color. And again, like if we don't expand our imagination, if we aren't creative, unfortunately, we will revert back, right? We will revert back to a complacency, thinking that somehow the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s took care of this. Clearly didn't, the Civil War was won. Clearly not, we are. I just want us to look back at this moment and tell ourselves we were as imaginative, creative, collaborative, humble as possible. I don't have all the answers. I have a deep hope for us, all of us and our families, that the democratic experiment will continue in this country and others. I have a sense that we are all interconnected, as I can see from the chat, and I'm really excited to get into your questions. And I want to hold both accountability and imagination together. I don't want them to be separate, which is why I wanted them to be the theme of my talk. We must be accountable to the realities that millions of people face, including ourselves today, whether it comes to climate or economy or racial injustice or democracy or immigration and migration. We want to be accountable to that. And at the same time, we want to live into the creativity and imagination of so much of human history has for us. And I think we can look to lots of places, some of which I've named, to find that inspiration. So whatever we do, let us not go back. Let us not fall back into whatever habits we had individually in our leadership or institutionally. And let's rise to this occasion as best as we possibly can. Okay, that is the end of the talky part. I missed 1,000 questions. Please raise your hand if you want to chat with me. I'm going back up into the chat to see if I can. They overlook you because I mainly work independently and not part of a particular group. Yes, I agree with that, Rasha. I think that if we look at individual donors, really shaping philanthropic giving, we can also look at all the individuals that shape the landscape of our ecosystems of social movements. And I know lots of the activists around Black Lives Matter and the racial justice movements of the last years don't necessarily claim a 501c3. So I think we also need to live and live beyond a 501c3 model. We could look to Way to Win for that and others. Thoughts on the uncomfortable relationship between the nonprofit sector and uber high net worth individuals? Yeah, I mean, Sam, you're talking about capitalism. I welcome anyone's thoughts about how do we create a capital market that doesn't mean that one person gets to be the benevolent giver of billions of dollars. I mean, clearly, as Edgar pointed out, that's problematic. And at the same time, do we love that those billions of dollars where they went to? Absolutely. I think we have to live in complexity and in sometimes duality. Like there's no pureness when it comes to money. I think money makes everything weird. And yet it is a necessary source of energy and power in the society. What advice can you offer to performance arts organizations? Oh, I really feel performing arts organizations and the arts industry in general. I mean, I think that's another culture shift to really, I'm glad you raised this, Diane, because I think the connection between culture change and political change, preservation of democracy is huge. Sonia Childress is on my board and she's part of the Perspective Fund. And there's just an incredible weaving of how the dynamism of arts and culture feed the social imagination. And we need it, and we need you, and we need your organizations. All I can do is have a plea for my peers who don't fund in the arts and think that we can, this is bringing up another point, think that we can fund in really siloed ways. Well, I simply fund in immigration, or I simply fund in civic engagement. Yes, and I think that everything is interconnected. So arts and culture are just as connected to human rights and civic engagement, in my imagination at least. How to offer multi-year funds in a field with hundreds of practitioners, smaller funders giving out hundreds of micro organs would be effective. I see. Ted Russell, I appreciate that question. I try to think of it as there's unlimited capital, because there is, you know, we're in a place of really made up numbers in this country. So I try not to think in terms of like, how do we disperse a small pie into smaller ones? I try to think in terms of like, where are the sources of capital that are not being directed in these ways, and try to find them. I know Andrea is here talking about this in a different way. Let's see, how do you incorporate creativity and accountability? Yeah, Sylvia, that's a really good question. When I think about accountability, I think about who am I accountable to? Who are the communities and partners that I'm accountable to, and how do I get their feedback on an ongoing basis? So if you look at the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project website, there's a whole section on feedback and how we think about feedback as a dynamic part of trust-based philanthropy, because it's not that trust-based funders know everything and are experts at anything you can think of. It's more that we are in a dynamic accountability partnership with our grantee partners. And creativity, I don't know, that's like, let's talk to the woman who runs the NAP ministry, because I feel like we're just so accustomed to imagining and thinking about this work as a grind, and not necessarily creative and culture-based. So Scott, Chronicle Philanthropy just published a study, hate group receive millions, yeah. I do not think the IRS nor any part of the government should remain cause neutral in any sense at all. I was just talking to Yara Pang of the Just Fund portal that, that moved 80 million last year. And I asked her, what's your criteria for the kinds of nonprofits that you allow to use your platform to get funding? And she said, we absolutely do not work with anyone who promotes hate in any way. And so that's, Scott, you're bringing up a point to me that some people think that the comment that you're making here, or the question that you're asking, or the comment I'm making, that the IRS and the government should not be sort of cause neutral, that Twitter should not, that social media platforms should not be neutral when it comes to free speech and hate. Maybe we just differ, but I think that what we're talking about is values. We're talking about values. And if we value equity, racial justice, democracy, respect, polyculturalism, that we wouldn't allow hate groups to flourish in this country and culminate into what we saw on January 6th. Let's see if I'm missing any other questions. I actually want to see if anyone wants to talk. Janet, Pia, alternatives, oh dear. I lost it. Janet, alternatives can be sourced from ancient wisdom. Yes. Have you considered how Circle provides a way of opening beyond traditional economies? Yes. Yes, yes, yes to Circles. I would say that Thousand Currents, which is a grantee partner of ours, has partners with incredible circles in Nepal, like women's financial collectives. I've definitely thought about the ancient wisdom of Circles. I think about ancestral wisdom all the time. I think it's, I don't always talk about it as part of trust-based philanthropy, but it's certainly part of the way that I lead, is that I'm an expression of a lineage and a circle of ancestors, and I'm not necessarily just talking for myself. So 10-year grants. Prior session today discussed foundations as mission-driven versus financial. If mission-driven, their focus is how they can make an impact. If financially driven, the focus is on wondering what percentage of mission-driven foundations are there versus financially given. That is data, Ebba, that I do not have in my brain. I would talk to Candid and maybe CEP, other folks who maybe do that kind of research. But I don't know. I do think that, again, preservation of capital versus amelioration of the problem is the problem. I mean, hoarding wealth versus circulating it and investing it and helping communities become more self-determined and have more dignity is the problem. Hate is not free speech. Yes, I agree. I think that diverse perspectives, yes. The promotion of hate, the calls for assassination of elected officials, I can't get behind that as a nonprofit. Okay, so does somebody want to talk? Let's see. David? Am I doing this right? No, I did something wrong. Building on the idea that reputational failures occur, what do you think is best positioned to influence funders to overcome risk aversion? Activist trustees, Corey, fantastic question. That is, I think, the core question of the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. Please come and join us. All of you, please come and join us. We think about this all the time. You know, when I'm sort of, for some reason, like the Wizard of Oz just popped into my head, Corey, about your question. It's like, we're sometimes behind these pedigrees, these positions, these attempts to need to look very strategic and data driven when really all of us really don't know a lot necessarily. I think one of the things that we do, at least at Trust-Based Philanthropy, is insert the notion that being a learner practitioner actually makes us stronger and more resilient and smarter over time. So something about this ego and the reputational fear of I think some of it is being seen as like somehow inadequate or failing. I think we just have to be okay that we're sometimes inadequate. I don't know about any of you, but I felt a lot inadequate in 2020 as a parent, as a leader, as a community member. There were many moments of inadequacy. I think what we can do is we can collectivize our wisdom like we're doing here. And we can keep promoting the notion that that funders don't need to necessarily be experts. They can be listeners, followers, and learners. And in fact, that stance, that is a much more collectivized stance that will probably help us get to a different place. Okay, I'm gonna see if Brad can ask his question in person. I pressed a button. Oh, Brad, you're here. Brad. Hi, Brad.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can hear you, but you're in the dark. Do you want to be a shadow? Is this like a...
It's just a lack of lighting in here. Just a really quick comment.
Sure.
Talking about funding, two things. Common Good Earth, I just put that in the chat.
Yep.
And also CMS, Connecticut Money Society, which is under the Connecticut Association of Human Services, is doing a big piece on financial literacy. And with Luke Bronin being the mayor of Hartford, I think that's a great opportunity and a huge need for environmental justice, diversity, social justice, all the other issues that we're talking about. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. Some more questions coming through. Yes, Eva. Eva, Human Rights Learning Framework sounds powerful. I'd love to check it out. How much of the foundation community actually funds not just systems change and long-term solutions, but exploring more controversial alternative economic systems? I think, Karen, some. I have some friends, folks that do things with different things with capital, like the Working World, for instance, is an example. There's a few peer collectives that I'm part of. I would check out the Justice Funders and the Edge Funders Alliance. I think that there are some funders that are really working at radical edges around kind of a post-capital society. But thank you for the question. Okay, Jane, you're in here with me. I hope. I just hit the little button to let you in. I hope I didn't. Okay, David, to what extent should philanthropy radically increase the amount of investment in advocacy? Yes, 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 and yes. I mean, Daniel Lee, I think from Levi Strauss, was here yesterday, and he's been talking about funding advocacy for literally decades. I think yes to funding advocacy. I think there is go-to way to win. There's some really powerful ways to fund advocacy in both C3 and C4 context. Dimple from General Services in here too. I think that there's a lot of folks on the line right now that fund advocacy and saw saw some long-term results of advocacy funding in Arizona, Georgia, and some other states that were really powerful in the last election cycle. I'm gonna put up Cynthia Rojas. Cynthia.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, Cynthia.
Nice to hear you, Pia. You're extraordinary. I do have a question that's more of a concern, and I wonder where it sits with you. You know, the response in philanthropy, you gave it, I think, a B+. And so I know locally in New Haven, it's been really great, at least from my perspective. But my fear is this extreme shift to fund mostly COVID-related programming or efforts. And yet there was so much being funded prior to that. I am in no way, God, I hope I don't get hate mail, saying that COVID is not important. Youth development is also important. Financial literacy is important. Getting kids into college is important. And so I just don't know, do you ever think we'll balance the scorecard there? Or do you think we're in trouble because we move too fast and too far to the extreme?
That's a fantastic question, Cynthia, and I really appreciate it. I'm so glad you're here with me. I feel so alone up here.
No, you have a lot of people here with you, actually. I think 300.
So first of all, Hannah, what I think is that they're interconnected, right? I think what we have to do is stop saying that we fund only one issue area or one thing, right? So I think that we need, layers. So we need responsive funding that's emergent and emergency funding for all of these emergencies that keep happening, whether they're about climate change or immigration or democracy. I think we need to fund in that way. And then simultaneously, and this is where I go back to the notion that I think of capital as unlimited, right? I mean, it's unlimited for some, it just needs to be unlimited for all, right? So at the same time, I think we need patient long-term capital for infrastructure, for educational infrastructure, for public sector, right? We've been like our public infrastructure has been literally like eaten away like by piranhas for decades. And I think just we need to be rebuilding that public sector at the same time that because that public sector was eaten away, then the emergencies are even worse than they would have been. Like think if we had a really strong public healthcare system. Think if we really had available public health to everyone and think if the government had actually responded in a way that was in symbiosis with then you would be like in a country like New Zealand where one person died, right? Right. So I say that your question brings up a both and for me, which is we need to have, and that's why there's so many funders and there's so many players and we can bring on so many more, right? Like I want us to think in an infinite way versus a finite way about these problems and their solutions.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love that. Thank you. I love your thinking. I love it. Out of the box. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm going to talk to someone else left. Okay. Terrell. I'm just prioritizing the people who want to talk on cam, folks. Don't think I'm missing. Hey. It's Terrell?
It was, so it's Terrell, but since you got the first person's name right, I'm happy. Quick question. A little more about your side of it, who you are, piece of it, less than the really structural part. As a person of color in this space, how do you do rage control? Like when you're dealing with your donors, you're dealing with your board. Part of the reason why you're in a leadership position or we're in leadership positions is because they want our perspective. But I have to admit, I personally get a little concerned sometimes that like I'm pushing them further than they can go today. And I need to, like, on one level, I'm here to push them. And I don't want my own internalized colonialism to be the reason I don't push them as far as they need to go or are willing to go. So how do you make those decisions, those choices?
Wow. Thank you for that question, Terrell. I want to know how you do it. I mean, I'm like an acceptable person of color. You know, I'm kind of like light skinned, I'm a woman, you know, I mean, I feel like your experience is probably really different from mine. So
it's very real. I have a colleague who in our Zoom meetings, so I can do it in Zoom now. I'll ask her, I tell her like, look, if I'm going a little too far, like say, hey, drill it in something. So I let her be a gauge without really judging whether or not she's a good gauge. Because I just want to trust that I have colleagues who care about me and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
I find that I feel like, they really need to, like, we have to go a little bit further here. I can't just be worried that they're going to get me or something.
Yeah. And they're not. I mean, Terrell, I think you shouldn't, I mean, we're all in this dance when we're in some of these institutions, right? We're like, we need to feed our families. We need the healthcare. You know what I mean? We got fired today. I hope I did not get fired today. We'll see.
Right. It's their money, not ours, right? So. Right.
I mean, I think that like so I think I mentioned I'm in Costa Rica, literally in Costa Rica, right? And I'm here with my 2-year-old and my partner who's Black. And we honestly just said to ourselves, like, what does our spirit need? You know? And so less like what can they handle and more like what does your spirit need? You know? Like, does your spirit need to say this no matter what? You know? Does your spirit need to find out how I got to Costa Rica and call me up and I can be like, yeah, there's a place next door? You know what I mean? It's like, what does your actual spirit need? Because this change work is going to be a long game.
Right.
And there may be finite monies around us in this capital system, but our energy as humans, you know, we have to nurture, and our leadership, we have to nurture, and we have to nurture, and we have to keep in, like, be willing to work in philanthropy,
right? You
know? And so call me. Like, we can, the other way, I'll just say the other ways that I do it is I spend time in circle. Someone mentioned circle, but in peer groups,
right?
I can say what I need to say, you know? And then when I have to, you know, speak at a plenary, like there might be ways that I say things that I won't, you know, I won't edit myself in any way.
Right.
Although in appreciation to the people who organize this, I actually didn't edit very much today.
Right.
But I'm serious. I think that taking care of you and like what your spirit actually, somebody said, ask yourself what you need, not what you want, because if you frame it as what you want, you can tell yourself you don't get it today. I want a cookie. Well, I can't have a cookie today, you know?
Right.
Like, I need 3 months outside of the United States cultural, like, demagogic system.
Right.
That's what I needed, and that's what's happening, you know? I'm gonna put my email in the chat. You will email.
No, we'll do.
Okay.
We'll definitely do.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for asking. Oh dear, I have 2 minutes. There's more people. Araceli. I'm sorry I'm missing the chat questions, y'all. I'm letting folks jump in here with me. Araceli, are you here? Did I lose you?
Oh,
there you are.
Hi, thank you for your wisdom. I have a question. I'm from Los Angeles, and I've worked in the past with the labor movement. There's a lot of unionization happening in nonprofits, but I'm wondering in general, what can philanthropy do to ensure that the grantees they invest in are paying their employees equitably and giving them benefits, and even building career ladders for those employees to philanthropy, particularly when I see so many amazing first generation Yaleys and others, people of color, women in those ranks of workers. Thank you.
Yeah, Araceli, I was literally snapping like on the little hand box for this question. Thank you for asking this question. I think that this is part of what we need to be accountable to is workers, how workers are treated in our quote unquote industries. I would look at the work of, say, there's worker justice kind of efforts to pair with. I think that the Nonprofit Finance Fund has some really good resources for funders to get a comprehensive understanding of why, fair wages and, the myth, like letting go of the myth of overhead is part of what we need to do to build a stronger social infrastructure. I think part of what we research when we're researching partners is we want to find out how the people are treated inside the organization, both around HR policy and wages, and kind of generally, do people feel free to be expressive of their ideas in the organization. So that is part of the rigor with which we look at partners. But I think you need to keep raising this question. I know that there's people in the chat who are really working in that space of worker rights. Could you chat to Araceli? Because that's not exactly where I focus, but it is certainly part of what we think is of a trust-based funder would care about those kinds of things.
Thank you.
Take care in LA. Okay. Eloise, tell me if you need me to stop. I want to at least get everyone who wants to talk. Okay, we have someone else coming on up here. Let's see if there's, how can philanthropy help build social economic literacy to distract people away from anger and hate? Okay, I tried to let somebody in. I don't know if they're still coming. Let me try another person. Okay, maybe they are coming. Thanks for sticking around, folks. It's 2 minutes past the hour, so if this person shows up on my screen, then we will deal with that. Otherwise, I think we're probably going to have to close the session. Thank you, Caitlin. Oh yes, I'm going to share my contact here. Okay, so we are gonna close the session. I think it doesn't end until I end it. So I think there she is. Thank